So I'm so thrilled to be welcoming Professor Gregg Herken from University of California, Santa Cruz and Mercer today, who is a historian, a museum curator, and an expert on space history. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
So in your article, which was published earlier this month, you discussed the controversial exhibition of the B-29 bomber Enola Gay. First up, could you briefly recap what the Enola Gay represented and who felt or was threatened by its public exhibition?
Well, the Enola Gay was, of course, the bomber that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. It's only a large artifact, a metallic object, but it symbolizes, and I think this is the reason why there was controversy, it symbolizes the debate over the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And that debate has never really been resolved. Even today, there is great division in the United States, if you ask people, as to whether the atomic bomb was decisive in ending the war. I think actually now even a majority of Americans believe and would argue that the bomb was decisive to that. But in fact, the issue is, I think, more complex than that. And it was that complexity that the exhibit would have dealt with had it gone forward. As you know, and as you learned from the article, that there really was no exhibit on the question of the decision of to drop the atomic bomb. It was really just an exhibition of the artifact of the bomber. The timing was probably the worst we could have picked, because it was the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. Is a time when the veterans were, frankly, of the war were dying. The veterans understandably wanted to be celebrated for their contribution, and they did not want to be any question about their sacrifice or their role. And there wasn't really in the exhibit, but it did present a lot of the facts behind the decision to drop the bomb, including the context. The question that cannot be answered, but is constantly asked, is if the bomb had not been used, would the Japanese have surrendered before the planned American invasion of the Japanese home islands, which would have been in mid-November? Well, it's a counterfactual. I mean, we can never know what the truth is, but that's an argument that has been going on among historians, and more among historians than the public. The public, I think, is pretty much persuaded that the bomb ended the war, and that is part of the I think the folklore, if you will, of that whole issue.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because the question seems to have been a taboo, really, in the public. But as you say, I mean, this counterfactual history is something that it's interesting to so many people, and the question has been asked. And what do you think that this kind of public display of the bomb itself and the concept that you had in mind, how was that so threatening? What is the role of museums and these material objects? And you also mentioned in your article other objects that really represented just the violence.
I think if the exhibit had gone forward and all its complexity and length and everything, and it would have attracted a lot of attention. And I think that potentially it might have, I guess I could say, reawakened the debate over the decision to drop the bomb. Certainly would have introduced an American audience to the fact that there were many factors involved in the surrender of Japan, and that the atomic bomb was a major one, perhaps, but only one of them. I think, to answer more directly your question, is that I think it might have revived a debate, or even begun a debate within the American public of what was the role of the bomb in the decision, Japan's decision to surrender. As it is, I think that as I say, that debate really never seems to have been not really resolved, but that there are opposite sides, and they have become more extreme over time. There is the view that to question the role of the bomb in ending the war is unpatriotic on one side, and on the other side, the opposite side, is that the atomic bombing was in effect a war crime, that it was the use of a weapon of mass destruction against the civilian population. And the exhibit would have shown the complexity of all that.
I mean, it's incredibly complex, as counterfactual history always is, but it's kind of astonishing that it seems to have been this particular date, the anniversary, that had this effect on, I mean, really the course of history. Because if indeed your idea of the exhibition had, had made it, there might have been a different kind of discourse on the question itself.
Well, for one thing, the B-29 is simply too big to put the whole bomber into the Mall Museum, the Air and Space Museum on the Mall. When the extension at Dulles was built, that was when the bomber, which had been completely assembled and restored beautifully, the whole bomber was put on display at the extension at Dulles, they called the Udvar Hazy Center. And immediately there was a protest, and that there were people who showed up there with flags saying, banners saying this was a war crime, or this should not have happened. We're not going to celebrate this. And they threw red paint on the bomber, for example. Well, the Smithsonian staff was very concerned that this was going to be an issue and a constant problem, that there would always be protesters who would sneak in and try to damage the airplane. To my knowledge, I think that there's not been an incident since that first one, which occurred just when the museum opened. It's not the decision to drop the bomb as a debate is not a pressing issue for most Americans. It only really comes up again on the anniversary. And there are still pretty intense feelings on all sides about this, because I was asked by the Washington Post, they had a series called Myths About, and I was asked to write an article, 5 myths about the atomic bomb. And, it was essentially factual that, one myth is that there had been leaflets dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki warning of the atomic bomb before it was dropped. That's simply not true. There were leaflets dropped all over Japan, not warning of an atomic bomb, but of the conventional bombing that was at full scale at that time. Anyway, there are other myths there, and the response to the article, immediately within, I think, a day, there were almost 300 responses, and they were, as one could predict, they were kind of on opposite sides all the time. That this was a war crime; it should never have occurred. We should not celebrate this. To this, this saved the lives of at least 1 million American servicemen who would have died otherwise in the invasion of Japan. And actually, just that figure, 1 million, was iconic for the Air Force Association, that they really insisted that we use that figure, that 1 million American servicemen were saved by the atomic bomb. Well, there was never an estimate by any military authority that there would be 1 million killed. But the point is that, as Harry Truman said later, if any serviceman had been killed after the bomb could have been used, the blame would have been on him. So one can understand that there was tremendous pressure to use the bomb, not only military advantage, but also bureaucratic momentum. The weapon had been developed, we had it, we tested, it worked, and we figured it could be decisive in ending the war.
Yeah, incredibly high stakes. But to look at what effect it might have today, to think about these objects, these material objects and their exhibition, with wars increasingly being fought in the digital space, do you think that material reminders like the B-29 bomber are losing in significance? And what effect do you think that will have on commemorations staged by institutions like museums, like the Smithsonian?
It's a good question. I don't think there's, when you see the Enola Gay up front, it is a powerful symbol. And it shows just the amount of effort and energy and money and resources and intelligence that went into the business of the strategic bombing of Germany and Japan. So I think that there is an emotive quality to seeing the actual object, and that cannot be conveyed by social media. What I would compare it to is like the Vietnam Memorial. If you've seen pictures of the Vietnam Memorial, okay, it's this granite wall, all these names on it, but it really is quite evocative to go there and to see. And because I was at the Air and Space Museum, I walked down to the Lincoln Memorial and the Vietnam Monument at lunchtime, oftentimes, and to see the people there who were scratching the, basically reproducing the names on the memorial and leaving tributes, tennis shoes, flowers, a bottle of beer was oftentimes the favorite beer of the person who had been killed in the war. It was known by the person putting it there. That's a powerful experience, and something that really can't be conveyed by photographs or videos or things of that sort.
Yeah, it would be super interesting, or I mean, we will see, hopefully, how virtual reality will influence that. If it's really like the material object, the place, it's mythic quality that exists, or if virtual reality can really replace that. But I was thinking about how you could commemorate what we know of the conflict in Ukraine now, and who knows, maybe there will be like an artificial intelligence looking like President Zelensky and talking to people in museums. I mean, that would be amazing.
Indeed, I could well imagine that. I know already that the Air and Space Museum exhibits drones that had been used in warfare, mostly in Afghanistan. But I'm sure that there will be drones used in the probably a whole gallery of drones used in the Ukraine war. And one of the I've been away from the museum for quite some time, went back to academe, but I've been in touch with the curators that I worked with back when I was there. And one of the issues is just that, the use of technology, how to incorporate technology, and especially how to make it interactive in the visitor's experience, because quite frankly, the attention span of most young visitors is not what it used to be. So the idea of having what we call books on the wall, basically long label script, which certainly the Enola Gay exhibit had, is no longer in vogue. Is no longer very effective to a young generation. They just don't read the a long label. So it's a good point. I think you need to bring people in, and actually your example of having Zelensky talk about in a digital way, talk about the war would be quite interesting. And this gets back to the problem really that was faced with the Enola Gay, is how do you present a subject fairly, objectively to the audience. Otherwise, you're not doing an exhibition, you're doing propaganda. You're doing proselytizing. So that was one of the concerns that the exhibitors, the curators for the Enola Gay exhibit had in mind from the beginning. And it's frankly one of the things that got them in trouble, because what they were trying to do with the lead label was, what you want to do if you're being objective is present each side in its own terms. And their lead label was something like, for the Americans, it was a war of vengeance because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. For the Japanese, it was a war to preserve their sacred culture. Well, that was tone deaf, as they realized immediately, because it sounds like the Japanese were noble and the Americans were just vengeful. So that label went out early on, was thrown out early on, but it was an honest attempt by the curators to tell both stories, both sides in their own terms.
It's just fascinating, and also how this example shows us that historians and their work is incredibly relevant to public debate and also can stir such emotions. And I quizzed my students whether they knew what the Enola Gay was. And some of them knew the name, others, I mean, most of them didn't. But I then asked them to read the article, and they were all amazed at how, like, these existential questions, that they are relevant to us. And your article is an incredible resource for didactic purposes, but also just very, lovely to read, and just, it just makes you think a lot about modern day politics and public debate is like.
To tell you the truth, because it had taken place so long ago, and tensions were so high, and feelings were so high. I think, as I mentioned in the article, that the people in the public relations staff were on antidepressants, as were some of the curators, because we didn't know how to respond to the attacks on us, and the attacks were relentless. In fact, they were pretty vicious in some cases. That the lead curator for the exhibit was receiving death threats. So people had really intense feelings about, even if they didn't know what the exhibit said, what they had heard caused them to be very excited and upset oftentimes. So it just going back and looking at some of the documents and all, it brought back those feelings to me. And it is a shame that the exhibit never went forward as it was originally conceived. I think even some of our critics conceded that if people had actually seen what was written, what was planned, they would have realized it was more balanced than what the critics said.
Yeah, it's really a shame. But thank you so much for taking the time to revisit all those memories and to reflect on it, to write this amazing article, which is called "The Smithsonian's Decision to Exhibit the Enola Gay." And the article is available on our website, and we'll provide the link in the video description below. Just thank you so much for taking the time. It was great having you, and have a lovely day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.